All right, so today we're going to be looking at personal stories and how they can shed light on some really big issues in society.
Okay.
And we're going to be doing that through a TED Talk by Dalia Mogahed, where she talks about her experiences as a Muslim woman in America after 9/11.
Right.
And I think this is such an important perspective to consider, especially today as we're navigating, a world that is increasingly complex.
Yeah.
And, just for our listeners who might not be familiar with her talk, it centers around the kind of challenges that she faced simply because of her faith.
It's true. It's such a powerful example of how personal experiences can really help us understand these big, abstract, complex issues.
Yeah.
It makes it real for people.
Yeah, absolutely. And she talks about how 9/11 just changed everything for her.
Yeah.
Suddenly she was viewed with suspicion and fear just because she was Muslim.
Yeah.
Her whole identity was kind of put under a microscope.
And it raises a really interesting question, right? How do these events, major events, whether it's a political shift or a social movement,
Yeah.
how do they kind of change the way we see the world?
Right.
And also how they change the way we see ourselves.
Totally.
How do these external events reshape our identities?
Yeah.
And then we're forced to confront how other people perceive us.
Yeah.
And that's really unsettling.
It is unsettling. And,
Yeah.
Mogahed, she doesn't just stop at sharing her story. She kind of takes it a step further and explains how this fear surrounding Muslims, this is Islamophobia, isn't just a natural reaction.
Right.
She argues that it's being used as a tool, as a deliberate strategy to kind of manipulate public opinion.
I don't know if I'd say it's always intentional manipulation.
Okay.
But it's definitely true that media and political narratives can amplify this fear.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's unintentional, I guess.
Right.
But it definitely leads to a less than accurate understanding of entire communities.
That's a good point. Yeah. It's not always this malicious, coordinated effort.
Right.
But the impact is undeniable.
Yeah.
And that's where I think, critical thinking comes in.
Absolutely.
We can't just absorb everything we see and hear.
Right.
We have to question the information we encounter. We have to analyze it and really consider, who benefits from spreading certain narratives.
Yeah. One of the things that really struck me about her talk was her story about going to the mosque with her family after 9/11.
Yes.
Despite the heightened threats.
Yeah.
They could have easily just stayed home.
Yeah.
Because they were afraid.
Of course.
But they chose to go.
I get chills thinking about that moment.
Yeah.
It would have been so easy to just give in to that fear.
Right.
But they made a different choice.
Yeah. And what happened next is just amazing.
Yeah.
They were met with just this outpouring of support from people from all different backgrounds.
Wow.
It really shows the power of solidarity,
Right.
of choosing compassion over fear, even when things are really scary.
That's such a powerful point, choosing compassion.
Yeah.
It makes me think about, what we can do in our own communities to foster that kind of unity.
Right.
But, moving on.
Okay.
Mogahed then uses this incredibly powerful analogy to kind of explain the dangers of stereotyping.
Yeah.
She compares ISIS's relationship to Islam with the Ku Klux Klan's relationship to Christianity.
It's a really powerful analogy.
It is.
It really hits home.
Yeah.
We see this kind of oversimplification all the time.
Yeah.
Whether it's about political parties, geographic regions,
Oh, yeah.
even something like musical genres.
Right.
It's so tempting to rely on these stereotypes.
Yeah.
But Mogahed's urging us to resist that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's like judging a book by its cover without bothering to read the pages.
Totally.
And that's just a disservice to everyone.
Yeah, it really is.
Right.
It is. And it really highlights how stereotypes just prevent us from seeing the individual.
Right.
It reduces these complex identities to these simple caricatures.
Yeah.
And as Mogahed points out, this kind of thinking can have real world consequences.
Yeah, it makes me think about how we often, make assumptions about people.
Right.
Based on their appearance or where they're from.
Yeah.
Imagine being judged solely on whether you wear a hijab or a turban.
Exactly. And that's where the real work begins.
Right.
Mogahed challenges us to go beyond those surface level judgments, to actually engage with people who are different from us.
Yeah.
And try to understand their perspectives.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that we all have our own unique stories and experiences.
Okay, so we need to challenge stereotypes, but how do we actually do that?
Right.
Mogahed doesn't just leave us hanging.
Yeah.
She ends her talk with this super powerful question. What will you choose?
It's a call to action.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
She's pushing us to decide how we'll respond to fear and prejudice.
Right.
Are we going to let those emotions control us, or will we choose a different path?
It's interesting because she's not just talking about like these big dramatic choices.
Right.
It's also about the small everyday decisions we make.
Yeah.
How do we talk about others? What assumptions do we make?
Yeah.
Do we speak up when we see injustice?
I think what's so brilliant about her question is that it applies to everyone.
Yeah.
No matter who you are or what you believe, you're constantly faced with choices that either reinforce or challenge these harmful patterns of prejudice.
So it's not enough to just say, well, I'm not prejudiced.
Right.
We have to actively work to unlearn those biases and create a more just and equitable society.
I'm not sure I agree with the idea of unlearning bias completely.
Okay.
I think it's more about recognizing that we all have biases
Okay.
and then figuring out how to manage them so they don't influence our actions and decisions.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
It's not about pretending we're perfect, but more about being self-aware
Right.
and holding ourselves accountable. Kind of like how Mogahed talks about Islamophobia being used as a tool. Even if we don't consciously intend to discriminate, we might be unknowingly perpetuating harmful ideas.
Precisely. It's about understanding those larger systems of oppression and working to dismantle them.
And it's not just limited to Islamophobia.
Right.
Mogahed's message really resonates with any situation where fear and prejudice are used to divide people.
Exactly.
It could be racism, sexism, homophobia, anything.
Right. It's about recognizing those us versus them narratives
Yeah.
and refusing to buy into them.
And that takes courage, right?
It does.
Because speaking up against injustice, challenging those deeply ingrained beliefs,
Yeah.
it can be really uncomfortable.
It can be. But think back to Mogahed's story about going to the mosque after 9/11.
Yeah.
Sometimes the most courageous act is simply showing up, being present, and refusing to let fear dictate your actions.
That's so true. So what does this all mean for our listeners?
Right.
How can we take Mogahed's message and apply it to our own lives? I think it starts with recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more just and compassionate world.
Yeah.
We can't just, sit back and wait for someone else to fix things.
Right.
It starts with us.
It really does. And it doesn't have to be some grand gesture.
Right.
Even small acts of kindness and understanding can make a difference.
Like what? Give us some concrete examples. Like what can our listeners do in their daily lives?
Well, for starters, we can be more mindful of the language we use.
Okay.
Words have power, and the way we talk about others can either perpetuate stereotypes or challenge them.
Right, like avoiding generalizations about entire groups of people.
Exactly. And it's also about being willing to listen to and learn from people who have different perspectives than our own.
Okay.
That means stepping outside of our echo chambers and engaging in respectful dialogue,
Yeah.
even when it's uncomfortable.
Okay. So be mindful of our language. Seek out diverse perspectives.
Yeah. We can also support organizations that are working to fight prejudice and discrimination.
Okay.
Whether it's through donations, volunteering, or simply spreading awareness.
Right.
There are so many ways to get involved.
That's a good point. It's not just about changing our own individual behavior.
Right.
It's about supporting systemic change as well.
Absolutely. And it ultimately comes back to that question Mogahed poses.
Yeah.
What will you choose? It's a question that can guide our actions every single day.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with this thought. How can you actively challenge stereotypes and foster understanding in your daily life?
Yeah.
It might be a small action, a conversation, a choice to educate yourself, or a decision to speak up against injustice.
Right.
Whatever it is, remember that even small acts of courage and compassion can make a difference.
It's about creating a ripple effect.
Yeah.
Each one of us has the power to make a positive impact on the world. And it all starts with making a conscious choice to be part of the solution.